Hello and welcome to MalMakes. Today we're doing a painting based on Yoshi's Island. This is the full version. If you're interested in the time-lapse, you can click on the card here. Otherwise, let's get started. Admittedly, as I'm starting this painting, I haven't played a lot of Yoshi's Island. Steven and I have been streaming it on his Twitch channel, and I've gotten a chance to kind of see how the game works. Now, I have played like the first world before, but I'm starting to see like the further worlds, World 2 and 3, and see all the different things that this game is doing. And there's a lot of things I actually already want to paint from it, but the very first thing is from the storyline, where it's showing the stork crossing the ocean as the sun comes up. I thought it was really beautiful, and Yoshi's Island is really pushing that Super Nintendo to do some really cool, pretty things. So I thought that would be fun to kind of start with, is to paint that opening scene with the stork. So I've sketched it out, and I'm going to be tweaking some things from the game and tweaking some things on the sketch as it is. But the first thing I need to do is figure out like how much water there's going to be and draw that horizon line here on my canvas. And then I can start to paint in the sky and the water and figuring out exactly where the clouds are going to go, how big the stork and like the baby bundles are going to be. So I'm going to start to kind of build it up as I'm working. But the first thing is drawing in that horizon line. The gradient of the sky goes from yellow to violet, which are complementary colors. And when you mix complementary colors, you get mud. So I've done a lot of tests here on my sketchbook to kind of figure out the exact colors I want to use to make sure it wouldn't make some ugly mud color for my sky. Now, I started over here and I worked on doing one without any yellow and then doing a yellow wash, and one that had yellow mixed in and then doing a wash on top of that too. And the wash is just a transparent color, just so it doesn't mix when it's still wet. It kind of sits on top of this so it still has that bright yellow without getting muddy. And it worked all right. I wasn't super fond of it, so I kept doing more tests over here. And I ended up really liking this one here, where I kind of have yellow with just a little bit of violet, so it's a little muddy, and then it goes straight into the violet here. I found that the redder my violet was, the better this worked. So my sky's going to be kind of more of a warm red violet instead of more of like a royal violet, just to kind of keep that from getting too muddy on my sky. So I'm going to mix up some of these colors here, and then we'll start putting it on the canvas. I have 5 colors on my palette. This one here is going to be closest to the sun, and then we start to get a little bit more pink and then starting to get into violet until I'm to this darkest shade here. So I'm starting with this color here, and I know where my sun is going to be right here on this blue mark, so I'm going to start painting this color here. Now it's kind of an arc, but it's also very round in the sky as I shift through my colors, so I'm going to try and keep that as I go across this canvas, making sure I stay a bit more round instead of an arch. The gradient turned out really well, and even though I did all the tests and made sure all the colors would work, I was still a little bit worried of getting it here on the canvas. But I have this nice yellow glow and it goes into a pretty purple. So it's time to go back and work on the ocean. I had the horizon line at 6 inches across the bottom, and I want to bring that back. So I've done chalk marks 6 inches up, just a few spaces along the bottom here. And I'm going to be using some green painter's tape to tape above that mark, because I want the water to be below that. And I have multiple dots just to make sure that I have this level as I go across. Because if I only have one, like say over here, I might accidentally put the tape too far up. But I know that I need to meet this mark here, and the middle mark, and the side mark, and then the edge mark here. So it's going to be 6 inches across the entire canvas. I know I've said this in other videos, but it is my biggest tip to making sure that these paint lines are nice and sharp, is using a fingernail and just kind of scratching at the bottom to make sure there's a good seal along the bottom of where my paint is going to go. I haven't done the sun, so I've marked in halfway across my canvas so I can work on the reflection in the water without worrying about where it's going to be. I know it's going to be right in the middle, and 12 inches is halfway across my canvas. The water is much bluer than the sky, so I've mixed up similar colors, but they're a bit more closer to blue. So I was using some ultramarine blue with the Dioxine purple just to kind of make up these various colors. Now this isn't all the colors that the water is going to have, but it's kind of the baseline, so I can start to build that in. I'm going to start with my lightest violets here underneath the sun, and then start to get into the bluer and darker colors towards the outside corner. I started adding this light violet here on my canvas, and as soon as I did, I realized that I can keep everything along this line here in the center, but I don't know on each side how far out I'm going. So maybe on one side I'm going 3 inches, on one side I'm going 5 inches. It's going to look very strange in the end. So I took my ruler and made a dot every 2 inches across the tape. That way I could go on the canvas and say, well, this side over here is 1 space, 2 space, and a half, which would end up being 5 inches because it's every 2 inches for a mark. And then I can check it on the right side and say, well, this side goes 1, 2 inches, 3, 4 inches, and about 5 inches over here. So I know that that part is center at least, and I can kind of keep building my colors there. The next darkest purple, I might bring it out to this mark, and then I'll check it over here and say, well, 1, 2, 3 and a half, 1, 2, 3 and a half. So I know how far to bring each of those colors. Now I can go back to working on some details. I probably should have done the sun before I did the water, but it's okay because if I kind of fill this in and cross this horizon line a little bit, I can just hide any little imperfections I make by doing the sun by putting them as highlights on the water, because I need to do that yet too. So the next thing I have to figure out is how big the sun is going to be here on the canvas. And whenever I'm doing a sun on a painting or trying to figure out something that's kind of circular, I draw concentric circles on a piece of paper to make myself a tracer. So I use my compass for this and just kind of make a bunch of rings so I can see how big something should be. And I think this was probably the biggest it should be, so I started by cutting that out. Now I can go on the canvas and kind of play around with this and see how it needs to be and how big it should be. And if I put it here on the canvas, I liked how big it was in relationship to the painting so far. Now that's not taking into consideration the clouds or the stork or anything else. So I didn't really think it should be quite this big. In the game it's much smaller just because it's starting to peak above the horizon. So what I should do is cut out the next concentric ring and keep testing it to see how I like it. But I did like it on the big shape, so I thought I would try a small shape too before I started cutting out my rings. So I did another one that was smaller so I could test that. And I liked how that looked a lot better. It feels more like the game. It's going to give me some space for clouds and the stork and everything else. So I decided to go with the small one. And if I wanted, I could cut out some more of these rings to keep making it smaller and smaller until I was happy with it. But I decided I liked this size best. And then I had to play around with exactly where it was on the horizon. So I started with it a bit higher. I just used my compass to kind of block that and see what I thought, and I thought that was too high, it needed to be lower. So I kept playing with it until I found out that I wanted it right here on the canvas. And then I just used some chalk and drew in my tracer there. So now I can fill in my little half circle here with solid titanium white, and then start to bring some titanium white here to make ripples on the water, where the sun is just hitting the tops of each of those tiny waves. The sun is painted with titanium white, and it's a very opaque color, but after I had put 2 coats of titanium white on it, it still felt pretty transparent. So I took some gesso, which is even more opaque, put that over the top, and then because gesso kind of has a strange texture, I put titanium white on top of that. And now I think it's definitely opaque enough. I was bringing in some of these same colors in here to kind of give some glow to the water with some highlight, but I still need to add white just to give the bright highlight on top of each wave from the sunrise. The cool thing about painting older games is when they made these games, they were really limited by the hardware, the space on the cartridge, and what it could do, really. Yoshi's Island pushed that and made it very different, and they came up with some creative things to make things work for them. Now, one of the tricks they used is they used the same cloud shape over and over and just changed the size so that it works in the game, and you kind of think they all look a little bit different. But I can kind of take that a step further because I can paint whatever I want. So I can push kind of the intention of what they had and make it look even more realistic. So I'm going to roughly sketch in the clouds here so I know about the size and the shape and the placement of where I want them to go. And then I can start to tap in the white on the spaces that are closest to the sun, because that's where it's going to be hitting those clouds first and making them the brightest they can be. The clouds in game go from yellow to blue, and yellow and blue mixed together make green, and I don't want green clouds. So I thought I would do some tests in my sketchbook just to make sure I liked how the colors I chose work, and that I wasn't really getting any green colors. So the colors I chose worked really well, and I'll talk about those in a second, but the placement of the colors on the clouds is going to change for every single cloud. Now, if I look at my painting here, I've drawn in the clouds, kind of using this bubble system to help me shape the clouds, trying to figure out like how big pieces should be. And all of these clouds, like I said, are going to be different. So this one that sits right on the horizon line here, the right side is going to get hit by the sun rays first, casting a shadow on the left side. So all of these bubbles that sit closest to the sun are going to be pure titanium white, and the left side is going to be darker. Now this cloud up here, this tiny little one, it's going to have white on the bottom because the sun is hitting the rays on the bottom of that cloud, not on the right. And then over here, they're going to all be on the left side because the sun's hitting them on the left side first. So that's where the white is going on each cloud. And then I'm going to move into this yellow-gray color. Now, because the yellow and the blue make green, I'm going to use gray as a buffer. So I'm going to kind of go more into a gray color, and then I'm going to go more into a blue color and kind of work the yellow out and then work the gray out of that until I'm at regular blue. So I'm going to do the titanium white, this yellow color, and then this yellow-gray color. And after I have those three on every cloud, I'm going to let the painting dry. And then I'm going to clean my brush, so that way there's no yellow on my brush, all of the yellow on the canvas is dry, so the blue is no chance to turn green. When I'm tapping in these clouds, I'm just using this brush and just kind of tapping here on the canvas, building it back from the white into the yellow, and then into the blue-gray, and then into the blue. I'm using a smaller beat-up brush for the small clouds, and a larger one for the bigger clouds because it's going to make bigger marks on the canvas. Now, I keep these brushes around for clouds. Whenever my regular brushes, the ones I use for like sharp details like this, get old and don't make nice clean lines, I turn them into these cloud brushes, and then eventually they're not good for that either, and then they get thrown away or recycled into a different project. The cloud building has been going really well, and it's time to start adding the gray and blue-gray layers onto these clouds. Now, I've made sure that these yellows are all the way dry, so there's no chance of it mixing in with the blue as I'm adding it. It won't be turning green. It'll stay gray, it'll stay blue-gray. Now the bubbles that I've drawn in, they're just kind of my rough guidelines of the shapes of the clouds, how big they are, their placement on the canvas. Now this next one is a bit shorter, like on this bubble here, so as I move into my grayer blues and my bluer blues, it's going to be a bit shorter, and the next one's a bit taller. So I'm going to keep building my clouds, trying to kind of keep in line with the shape of that chalk. It's okay if I make the cloud a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. I can erase the chalk later, and if I've made it bigger, the paint's just going to cover it up anyway. Leaving the chalk on the canvas till the end of the painting is fine, but I don't want to forget about it and think it's paint when it's not. I could have some chalk here on the highlight part of the cloud and think it's paint, but it's chalk, and then later I erase it and I'm like, oh no, I forgot about that part. So I like to do it as I go along. I have to make sure everything's dry, and then I can just take a damp towel and wipe around the outside of each cloud. Now I'm going to add more chalk by drawing in stars and then using some liquid white to paint them in. Now I do this basically for every painting, where I use my chalk pastel to draw in what I'm trying to paint, then fill it in with white, and then paint it with whatever color it's going to be. So I'm just doing that here, and I really like the chalk pastel because it doesn't leave any lasting indentations or any marks. Even after I've painted, I can just wipe all the extra chalk off. And I've really found that using the chalk works best. Like pencil's easy to draw with, but sometimes it can leave lasting marks. So I'm just using the chalk here, and then I'm going to fill the edges in with a liquid titanium white, and then a heavy body titanium white for the center. The stork has really high contrast. It has these super bright areas, and then it also has some very, very dark areas like here on the wing. So I started with that titanium base as my base layer, but it's also functioning as the highlight on these edges. Then I've just taken some light gray and painted in from that in some of these areas so I can see that highlight. Now I'm just going to keep working grayer and bluer until I get kind of super dark ultramarine blue, carbon black in some of the darker areas on the wing. I'm still working on the wing because I find that ultramarine blue is quite transparent, so I'm having to do a few layers. But while that's drying and before I do its final layer, I think I'm going to tint the feet and the beak with just a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm using a lot of glazing liquid and just a little bit of it, just so it has a hint of orange. I didn't want the wings to look too static, so I didn't want them all the way up and I didn't want them all the way down. I just thought they'd look too frozen. I wanted it kind of in motion. So I went with something mostly open, where the tops are just kind of flipped down, starting a new wing beat. And I needed to make sure that you could see that and it didn't just look like gobbledygook at the top of this wing. So I took a little bit of my lighter blue and just defined the edge of this wingtip so it looked like it was flipped over. And we're done! We have the opening cutscene from Yoshi's Island. If you're interested in this piece, you could buy a poster, or a phone case, or bid on this original canvas. There's links down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find out more at supportmal.com. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of MalMakes, and I'll see you again here for another video game painting.